Let's go through a series of simplifying some algebraic expressions and see how well we can do together. The first one, though, however, I want to make sure we're aware of because it hasn't really been brought to our attention yet. If I have a negative x plus a 4, or a negative outside of a parenthesis by itself, what does that mean? What do we do with that? How do we simplify that? One way, well, maybe the best way to think about that is this negative right here, it really is a negative 1. And I can distribute that negative 1 across all the terms inside. So negative 1 times the x produces a negative x. Negative 1 times a 4 produces a 4. So when you see a negative outside of a summation that's guarded by parenthesis, you can distribute that negative across all the way through. And that's one way that we can simplify. Minus 2 times 3x. What do we do? That becomes a negative 6x. If I have 6x plus an x, it's an addition. I can add like terms. Those are some of the keys that are hopefully popping off in our heads. So 6x plus 1x produces 7x. 8a minus 9a. How do we subtract? 8 apples, take away 9 apples. I'm in the hole. I'm out an apple. So negative a, negative 1 apple. Suppose we have minus 3 times 2x minus 5. What do you want to do with that? I see a distribution property tool happening. So negative 3, distribute it to the first term, distribute it to the second term. You know what? Even if there's more terms in here, you distribute it to all the terms. So far, we've only seen them with 2 terms. So negative 3 times a 2x, negative times a positive, equals a negative. So it's a negative 6x. A negative 3 times a negative 5 produces a positive 15. And then let's see if we can remember what to do with this one again. What do we do with that? Negative's outside by itself, but it's really a negative 1. It's not really just a negative by itself. It's a negative 1. So let's distribute that across. So a negative times a positive 6y produces a negative 6y. A negative times a negative 8 produces a positive 8. All right, let's tackle this monster. How do we tackle a monster? How do we deal with a big problem? Let's solve small problems. And if we solve enough small problems, we get to go home. First of all, I see a distribution property in this first set of terms. So we can distribute this 5 across both of those terms. Positive 5 times a positive 2y gives me a positive 10y. Distribute the 5 now to the 9. It's positive 5 times a 9 gives me a 45. Now I have this negative here that's outside. The best way to deal with that is distribute the negative across. So negative times a 9y is a 9y. A negative times a negative 8 gives me a positive 8. One thing might be kind of hard to explain, but you might be wrestling with this, is that I go back and forth between saying a subtraction and a negative. And that's because they're essentially the same thing. When I distributed this 5, I could have distributed a 5 to the 2y, makes a 10y. Then I could have treated this as a negative 9. 5 times a negative 9 makes a negative 45. Or I could have left it as a negative and just did the 5 times a 9. That I would have got to subtract a 45. So that's something that we're going to wrestle with, is understanding the similarity between those two ideas so they become second nature to you. All right, we can collect our terms now. But first, I guess before collecting the terms, I'm going to rewrite everything as a positive or as an addition. So 10y plus a negative 45 plus a negative 9y plus an 8. Now, why did I have to do that? Why couldn't I have just switched those two terms around already? And that's because the commutative property works over addition. It doesn't work over subtraction. What, you don't believe me? Well, let's look if we had, for example, 6 minus 3. If we can turn those two terms around, I'd have 3 minus 6. Do you think those both get the same result? No, they don't. So commutative property works over addition. Because of that, I need to rewrite this sequence of terms as terms being added together. Then I can go ahead and use the commutative property and remove and move them around if I desire so. So 10y plus a negative 9y plus a negative 45 plus an 8. Like terms are grouped together. Gives me a y minus, well, plus a negative 45 plus an 8 gives me a negative 37. And then I could rewrite it as well as 7 take away a 37.